Inside Texas Politics 3rd Edition by Brandon Rottinghaus. Chapter 7, Part 1. The Legislator. The ink was barely dry on most legislation when Big Three, the governor, lieutenant governor, and Speaker of the House gathered for a picnic on the south lawn of the governor's mansion in celebration. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick deemed the 2019 legislative session the most successful in state history and labeled it the Super Bowl of legislative sessions, delivering on promises to boost teacher pay, increase funds for public education, and cap property taxes. Not all sessions end in bear hugs and congratulatory picnics. Indeed, in 2017, the Texas House erupted in violence on the chamber floor as hundreds of protesters carrying signs reading, "I am illegal and here to stay," poured into the gallery to disrupt the last day of the regular session. Republican Representative Matt Rinaldi turned to Democratic Representative Pancho Navarez and chuffed F them. "I called ICE." Navarez threatened to get Rinaldi, and Rinaldi threatened to shoot Navarez in self-defense. Pushing and shoving ensued, and the scuffle was broken up by other members. This conflict is just the tip of the iceberg. In the past 100 years, Texas legislators have erupted into fistfights, the waving around of firearms, one member shooting off blanks at the ceiling, and passage of amusing resolutions to ridicule colleagues, such as one declaring the hoverboard Safety Awareness Day after a representative broke his wrist while falling off a hoverboard. Legislative politics is not all fun and fighting, however. The legislator passes laws that affect every part of the lives of Texans, ranging from how much sales tax they pay to the quality of their schools to the condition of their roads, with a budget that tops $250 billion every 2 years. Everyone has a stake in the game. To examine the unusual but important world of the Texas legislator, we first analyze its function and the tasks legislators carry out. We examine the structure of the legislator and compare it to that in the other states. We outline the legislative process, paying special attention to the scramble to beat the calendar and to the way political struggles are resolved within this framework. Finally, we explore the demographics of the legislators. 7.1 The functions of legislators and legislators. The grand wings of the enormous Texas Capitol, which appear pink because of its sunset red limestone color, house the number 181 members of the Texas legislature. Every odd-numbered spring in Austin, like the federal Congress, the Texas legislature, called the Leg by observers, is a bicameral legislature, meaning it has two houses or chambers, the House of the Representatives and the Senate. French political theorist Montesquieu, House of the Representatives and Senate, French political theorist Montesquieu first conceived of this division as a means of ensuring that the minority would have a voice in public affairs that could not be shouted down by the majority. Lawmaking. The Texas legislator's chief responsibility is to create and pass legislation, laws, establish and reinforce economic interactions, resolve disputes between individuals or groups, and protect the rights and liberties. The legislator's laws dictate everything from the sales tax people pay on cars to the type of insurance they are required to carry to how many hours of training a hairstylist needs in order to be licensed. The state legislature introduces bills on a wide variety of matters, some of which are serious and some of which are less. See Table 7.1. Legislation considered by the legislator can be a general law. If the bill potentially affects all Texans, a local law. If it affects only units of government at the local level, often carried out by a legislator at the request of local government leaders, or a special law. If it exempts businesses, organizations, or individuals from state laws. 3 bills filed by El Paso Democratic Representative Mary Gonzalez in the last legislative session illustrates these different types. A general law to require a minimum education requirement for child protective service caseworkers, a local bill to establish a law school in El Paso County, and a special bill to exempt campus police from cooperating with federal immigration officers in deportation-related law enforcement. In addition to bills that carry the force of the law after being signed into law by the governor, legislators debate and pass resolutions that convey the will of the chamber. These resolutions include joint resolutions are used to propose amendments to the Texas Constitution or to ratify proposed amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Concurrent resolutions are passed separately but simultaneously by both chambers and are used to direct state agencies on procedural issues such as legislative adjournment or special sessions initiation. Simple resolutions are passed by a single chamber and are used for adopting or changing rules of procedure or expressing congratulations or condolences. Simple resolutions are also used ceremonially to highlight Texas history or to promote local tourism, such as declaring the state snack, chips and salsa, the state fruit, red grapefruit, or wedding capital of Texas, Dripping Springs, a town located west of Austin. The legislature often follows a similar procedure to pass each of these types of resolutions. The legislature is also tasked with overseeing implementation of the laws passed in previous sessions to ensure that the programs and policies are operating effectively. Oversight may include program evaluation for executive agencies, periodic audits of legislative spending, or regulation of the rules implemented by executive agencies. The legislature can hold hearings to investigate abuse, mismanagement, or abuse of power. Typically, the executive agencies. Lawmakers exorciated, officials from the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services in 2016 for an unexpected increase in reported cases of abuse and for shortage of foster care beds. Heads roll when investigations lead to the removal or the impeachment of officials. With governor's consent, 2/3 of the Texas Senate can remove an appointed official. The Texas House can also initiate impeachment proceedings by bringing charges against an executive or a judicial branch official. And the Senate sits as the jury where a 2/3 majority is needed to convict. The legislature can also revise laws in later session if problems arise during implementation. Texas House versus Senate. Although both chambers serve the same general function, important differences between them remain. The larger number of members and the shorter length of term, in theory, make the Texas House of Representatives a more representative and responsible body than Texas Senate. Like the U.S. Constitution, the Texas Constitution designed the legislator with the idea that the House would be more accountable to the popular will and the Senate would be more deliberative. The House. The Texas House is made up of 150 members. The entire membership is up for election every 2 years. The Texas Constitution requires members of the Texas House to be at least 21 years of age, a citizen of Texas for 2 years prior to the election, and a resident of the district from which he or she is elected 1 year prior to the election. Senate. By contrast, the Texas Senate has 31 members who are elected for 4-year terms from districts that carve up the state. Half of the membership is elected every 2 years, so the entire chamber is not up for re-election in any single cycle. As outlined in the Texas Constitution, a senator must be 26 years of age, a citizen of Texas 5 years prior to being elected, and a resident of the district from which he or she is elected 1 year prior to election. Responsibilities. Similar to the U.S. Constitution, the Texas Constitution grants the House responsibilities that the framers believed belonged in the hands of the people, while the Senate serves as the vehicle for protecting minority interests against the tyranny of the majority. So, for example, all revenue bills must originate in the House so that the power of the purse, funding policies remain in the hands of the people. The House and the Senate take turns originating the budget bill every other session. The Senate is granted responsibilities that require more deliberation, such as confirming or rejecting all of the governor's appointments to state boards and commissions. The Senate confirms a nominee through a 2/3 vote. Hometown senators from the hometown of the nominee, are given some authority to reject a nominee. But this is usually not necessary because an astute governor will clear the nominee with the hometown senator before submitting his or her nomination. Most nominations are confirmed because problems are smoothed out early as part of the Senate's more deliberative process. But trouble can flare as nominees wade into political waters. For example, David Whitley, the acting Secretary of State and close aide to the Governor Greg Abbott, had to answer tough questions from a Senate hearing after a botched attempt of a scour non-citizens from voter rolls that questioned the eligibility of 100,000 legitimate voters. Although officials later did find the list chock full of non-eligible voters as well, the Senate did not confirm his nomination, forcing the governor to appoint someone else as Secretary of State. Casework. Legislators also have extra tasks outside the legislature that they must attend to if they are to succeed in future legislative sessions and win re-election. Between sessions, legislators and their staff spend time on casework, assisting constitutions in their districts with specific requests, and often acting as facilitators, go-betweens, or advocates. For instance, a constituent may request help applying for a state grant, obtaining a specific government benefit, or seeking relief from a state agency. Legislators also meet with citizens, lobbyists, and organized groups to facilitate or to stop legislation of interest to the district. For example, early in 2001, legislative sessions, Senator Letitia Von de Putte met with lobbyists representing teachers, prison guards, demanding a pay raise, and leather-clad bikers who wanted to exempt alcohol carried in saddlebags from the state's open container law. Winning re-election. Legislators must engage in political scientist David Mayhew identifies as position taking, and credit claiming in order to win re-election. Let's look at each of these terms in turn. Position taking. Position taking involves members proclaiming where they stand on certain issues or policy. Former Speaker of the Texas House, Pete Laney, would say members vote your districts. Before every vote, as a reminder not to forget why the legislators were in Austin in the first place, he left office with a similar sentiment. Pay attention to the process, pay attention to your constituents, and do what you think is right for the state of Texas. Sometimes you've got to weigh that. What's right for your constituents and what's good for the whole population. Indeed, some legislators act as trustees of their constituency, voting in accordance with the interpretation of what their district would want. Other legislators act as delegates, where members are simply a mouthpiece for the wishes of their constituency. Speaker Laney once noted, "The first time I ever voted in 1973 on a real controversial bill, I worried about it, and I finally said, this is not worth it. I'm going to vote for what I think is right for my constituents." 30 years later, I was still there. There's no way you can worry about getting reelected and do what's right. Legislators often craft a certain image to appeal to voters to gain their trust, which they then use to explain and justify decisions made in Austin. Political scientist Richard Fenno calls this development the home style of legislators. The way in which legislators are elected encourages a close relationship between the members and the citizens, fostering accountability. Credit claiming. Credit claiming often occurs when legislators point out the positive things they have done while in office. Most members produce newsletters for their constituents and make frequent trips home for town hall style meetings. This communication creates a pathway to accountability. In recent years, legislators have begun utilizing social media to make sure their constituency follows their achievements. The hashtag TXLEGE hashtag has become a one-stop shop for breaking news and instant opinions from legislators and Capitol watchers, including journalists and lobbyists. See Figure 7.1. Representative Wayne Christian notes, "The reason I got involved in social media then is because back home, and I lived 300 miles away while I was up in Austin working a 10-month session, my opponent is saying, 'Hey, where's your rep? He's not working for you.' So I started posting pictures of where I was and what I was doing so I could prove I was working hard for them in that 10-month session we had." The number of tweets from legislators on Twitter rose 67% between 2011 and 2019. Legislative sessions, 27 legislators sent more than 1,000 tweets in the 86th session, including Representative Pancho Navarez, who sent 12,925 tweets, averaging 49 tweets per day. 7.2. The Texas Legislator in Context. Political scientists often classify a legislator as strong or weak based on whether they have access to adequate resources to carry out their functions. Strong legislators consist of full-time professional, well-paid legislators with year-round or annual sessions, plentiful legislative staff, and competitive elections. By many of these standards, Texas has a weak legislator due to the length of its sessions, salary, staff, and boards that facilitate the legislative process. The legislative session. The Texas legislature meets biennially every 2 years in the January of the odd-numbered years. In the maintaining of this schedule, Texas is unique among large states. Just 3 other states, all smaller ones, have biennial legislative sessions. In the 19th century, when travel was more difficult and the public distrusted corrupt state legislators, many states switched to a biennial system. However, between 1960 and 1970, as state budgets became larger and legislation more complicated, most legislators switched back to an annual session. Many watchers of Texas politics believe the state legislators should hold annual rather than biennial sessions. As the state's population has increased and the economy has diversified, the legislator continually address a broader spectrum of issues. Indeed, the number of bills filed has risen sharply, yet the percentage of bills passed has declined. This suggests that the legislator may not be able to keep up with all of the issues its members wish to address. See Figure 7.2. Between 1945 and 1975, however, Texas voters, wary of powerful government, rejected 5 constitutional amendments calling for a switch to an annual session. Each regular session of the Texas legislature meets for 140 days, longer than most states with set lengths. See Figure 7.3. In addition, the governor can call a special session on any issue he or she would like the legislator to address. Special sessions are limited to 30 days. Special sessions are called roughly every other legislative session, as we will see in Chapter 8, and allow the legislator to address issues that were not taken up or settled during a regular session, emergencies or legislative belly flops on an important issue. The end of the legislative session is called a sindee, Latin for without day, during which the body adjourns, accompanied by much rejoicing of weary legislators and exhausted staffers. The legislative staff. Critics complain that the budget for the legislative staff salaries is too low to hire an adequate number of people and to keep quality staffers from taking other opportunities. Senators are allotted $38,000 per month and House members $13,250 each month to run the offices. Legislators often use campaign funds to supplement staff salaries, but this is too much in debt legislators to organized interest by forcing greater reliance on the groups that finalize their campaign. This insufficient staffing creates an opening for organized interest groups to step in to provide policy competency and persuade legislators to vote with them on legislation. Legislative boards and councils. As a way to compensate for a part-time legislator, some of the powers of the legislator are siphoned off to several boards and councils, all of which serve important roles. The Legislative Budget Board, LBB, for example, writes the first draft of the state budget, setting the stage for future debate. The Lieutenant Governor, who presides over the Senate, and the Speaker of the House, co-chair the LBB. They also appoint the remaining 8 members from their respective chambers. Because many legislators may not have the expertise necessary to draft bills, the Legislative Council assists in writing legislation, conducting research, and providing legal support. The Legislative Council also provides the technical nuts and bolts evaluation of policy options in state government. Salary. Despite the size of its economy and population, Texans believe in small government keeps legislators' annual salary at $7,200, the lowest set legislative salary in the nation. Legislators also receive a $221 per diem for meals and travel, a total of $31,000 for daily expenses during a regular session. The per diem pay also is fixed to the amount lobbyists can spend on lawmakers before they have to submit a detailed expense report. The threshold is $114, 60% of the per diem. Legislators are expected to have other jobs because lawmaking in Texas is not designed to be a full-time occupation. Professionalized legislators' full-time year-round session in other states tend to pay legislators more. Texas members can use campaign accounts to supplement their lifestyles, but not to pay themselves a salary. Former Republican Senator Troy Frazier, for example, spent more than $300,000 from his campaign account, maintaining a personal airplane, paying country club fees, buying suits, and traveling to faraway locations like Hawaii and Buenos Aires. The relatively low pay makes serving in the legislature easier if a person is wealthy enough to self-finance, but the vast majority of legislators hold day jobs. Incumbency and turnover. Low salaries and biennial session can lead to high turnover rates among legislators. Too much turnover can be a problem, leading to a loss of institutional memory. That is, an understanding of how a complex organization runs. Legislators without institutional memory may be less effective. Representative Garnet Coleman of Houston argues, your power comes from your knowledge of the subject matter. Ultimately, that's the thing with seniority. It's being around long enough to actually learn something. The Texas legislature has strong continuity and institutional memory because most elections for Texas legislators are won by the incumbent. See Figure 7.4. In the 87th legislative session, 2021, most legislators had been between 1 and 10 years of legislative experience, and more than a dozen members had served more than 20 years. Lack of turnover, however, can mean that leadership positions are held by the same senior members and that frustrated younger members who want to turn management are frozen out. Consequences of Texas legislative structure. The consequences of the part-time legislator columnist Molly Ivins called it a sometimes government may hinder representation and public policy. Development. Fewer resources, a shorter time span in which to meet, and lower salaries may put part-time Texas legislator at a disadvantage. Scholars of the state politics have found that part-time legislators are less likely to have as much contact with their constituents, are less likely to be attentive to their concerns, and are more influenced by party leadership and the governor. In terms of public policy, part-time legislators are also less willing to take on government reforms and to enact the complex and innovative policies a state may need. 7.3, how the legislator is organized. The legislator isn't just a collection of individual legislators. The organization of the legislature shapes how issues are introduced and how legislation is debated, and determines which laws are passed and which fail to pass. The committee system. Most of the work of the two chambers is carried out through committees, small groups of legislators who investigate, craft, assess, and take action on legislation before it is considered by the whole body on the House or Senate floor. Excuse me. Each member of the legislature sits on at least one committee, but often more than one. Legislators specialize in policy topics and form legislation that addresses a particular problem. Membership on committees is usually determined by a combination of seniority and policy expertise, but politics plays a role as well. The 86th legislature, the 2019 session, had 53 committees, including one select committee. Standing committees. Standing committees are permanent committees that deal with specific issues or topic. The State Affairs Committee also handles most of the Senate's important legislation, acting as a clearinghouse for the lieutenant governor's bills and vetting controversial legislation. Important standing committees in the House are the Appropriations Committee. There are several, each devoted to a specific part of the spending funds from the budget, and the House of Ways and Means Committee, which monitors the state revenue and taxes. All budget and funding items for the state flow through these powerful committees. A select committee is a committee that is temporary and has a fixed issue to investigate or legislation to consider. In the 2019 session, for example, the Mass Violence Prevention and Committee Safety Committee was tasked with investigating the causes of mass shootings, including incitement of racism and violent political culture. Legislators compete to get onto the most influential committees and onto those that consider policy issues, especially relevant to the districts they represent. Legislators ultimately hope to serve as chairs as committees so that they will be better able to direct and influence legislation. The leaders of each chamber, the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor in the Texas Senate, determine which legislators to reward with these more powerful positions. Speaker of the House. Speaker of the presiding officer in the Texas House. The Speaker of the House is elected by a simple majority of the House in a recorded vote at the beginning of every session. The Speaker has several powers, one of which is to resolve all questions of process and procedure within the House. The Speaker also decides which legislators become committee chairs and assign most of the committee members. These not determined by seniority, which fixes half of all committee positions in the House, and therefore can stack committees with allies. This is an especially important power when it comes to assigning the calendar committee, which determines the order of bills considered. These powers make the Speaker the most influential member of the chamber, whose successes and failures give rise to achievements, reforms, and shifts in the policy process. See Table 7.2. Because most action takes place in committees, positions on these committees are highly sought after. Members who aren't part of the Speaker's team are often less influential in the session and may have a tougher time raising the funds and votes necessary to win re-election. Speakers can use committee assignments to punish disloyalty. When Ben Barnes was a 22-year-old legislative freshman in 1961, he privately admitted to the newly elected Speaker of the House that he had campaigned against him and thus didn't deserve a committee assignment. The Speaker asked Barnes which committees didn't want to be on. Barnes answered, "The Liquor Regulation Committee, because I come from mostly a dry district with about 27 Baptist churches." The next week, when the committee list came out, Ben Barnes was at the top of the list for the Liquor Regulation Committee. Committee assignments and the Craddock's D's. After taking over in 2003 as the first Republican Speaker since Reconstruction, Tom Craddock had to contend with dwindling Republican support in the House. He doled out committee assignments that punished political foes and rewarded political friends, particularly Democrats, who were willing to cross party lines and support Republican initiatives, a group that became known as the Craddock D's. Eventually, however, Craddock's autocratic style even rubbed Republicans the wrong way. Even Republican members of the House, called the Polo Road Gang, because they met at Representative Byron Cook's house on Polo Road in Austin, decided to join with the Democrats to back Republican Joe Straus as Speaker over Craddock. Craddock's overthrow sent a clear message to future speakers that representatives would not be tyrannized by a speaker who abused his or her power. Soon after assuming the position of the speaker, Straus met with the committee chairs and told them that the pace of the session was up to them, that they would run their committees, and that if everyone followed the rules, he wouldn't call any fouls. Processes and procedures. Speakers decide all questions of processes and procedure, and so they can indirectly influence the fate of the specific legislation. For example, speakers assign legislation to committees. If a speaker sends a bill to a hostile committee, the committee can kill the bill. Conversely, if the speaker sends it to a friendly committee, the committee can enhance its chance of success. A similar procedural tool is the power of recognition, through which speakers call on House members, allowing them to speak during the discussion of a bill. Seemingly unimportant, the power of recognition allows speakers to either to lengthen discussion or to end debate. In the 1971 session, Speaker Gus Muscher Jr. presided over a House that was split between wets, like Muscher, who favored the sale of alcohol, and Dries, who did not. At one point during the debate, the House Speaker looked up and saw that 100 out of 150 legislators stood in favor of the measure, enough to pass the motion. He quickly announced that the gavel is coming down, to end the debate, and had the sergeant at arms lock the door to the chamber so that those legislators who were present couldn't leave and change their minds. The Lieutenant Governor. As we shall see in Chapter 9, the Lieutenant Governor is often referred to as Light or Little Governor, is one of the most powerful elected officials in Texas government. Although not a member of the Senate, the Lieutenant Governor acts as its presiding officer and is officially called the President of the Senate. Thus, the Lieutenant Governor only casts a vote in the case of a tie. However, he or she enjoys other, more extensive powers. The Lieutenant Governor has full authority to assign senators to committees and appoint committee chairs. But unlike the Speaker of the House, the Lieutenant Governor is not limited by seniority in assignments. Informally, senior senators get first pick at committee assignments until 1/3 of the committee is filled. The Lieutenant Governor assigns legislation to specific committees, allowing him or her to influence the chances of a bill becoming a law. For example, in 2015, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick sent a bill to ban in-state tuition for the children of undocumented immigrants to the Border Security Subcommittee instead of the Higher Education Committee or Senate Committee on State Affairs. Patrick knew that the Border Security Subcommittee was more likely to oppose the measure, and indeed the subcommittee killed the bill. This is the end of part 1 on Chapter 7.